Hi there, I'm Mabel Chan, and this is One in a Billion, part 5 of our special series, True Colors. True Colors is about the color of our character, not our skin in times of crisis. How we respond reveals who we are, our values, our beliefs, and our sense of justice and fairness.
As Chinese Americans and as Asian Americans, we have contributed a lot to this country, but also I think we've contributed to a lot of its violence and a lot of its anti-Blackness and its evils, and that's something that we have to really reckon with.
That is Eileen Huang, a creative writer and a junior at Yale University. Earlier this summer, she wrote a letter to address her community at ChineseAmerican.org. At the outset, she put a warning about its content. White supremacy, stereotypes, and racial violence. It's gone viral, inviting lots of support and criticism. The divide comes down to her most controversial point that there is rampant anti-Blackness within the Asian American community.
The ability for people like my family and for basically all the Asian American families who immigrated here after the 1960s or the 1970s, we literally owe our existence on this land to Black Americans.
In this episode of True Colors, we're talking about we owe them. Here's our conversation. Eileen, I want to start the interview by asking about your letter to the Chinese American community at Yale University. This is what caught my eye at the very outset. You wrote, "We Asian Americans have long perpetuated anti-Black statements and stereotypes. I grew up hearing relatives, family friends, and even my parents make subtle, even explicitly racist comments about the Black community. They grow up in bad neighborhoods. They cause so much crime. I would rather you not be friends with Black people. I would rather you not be involved in Black activism." So these are some of the things that you grew up hearing. So my question for you, Eileen, help us understand the context for this article. What prompted this piece?
So I actually was not asked to write an article about anti-Blackness. It sort of was more spontaneous. So I have a family friend who contributes to the publisher, this WeChat publisher that the letter was published on, Chinese American. And she contacted me because I'm primarily a creative writer and I write a lot of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I write a poem in response to this new documentary series that just came out, Asian Americans, on PBS. But this happened days after George Floyd's death, and I mean the entire world, or at least the entire nation, was just watching that horrific video of Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck. And I just really couldn't get that image out of my mind because it really embodied a lot of the Black liberation struggle in the United States, and also it made me reflect on how my community, the Asian American and the Chinese American community, what we've done to perpetuate that kind of anti-Blackness, which, as we see, can tangibly hurt people. And so I just really couldn't stay silent about it. And I was really moved to write this letter directly to my community on a platform that a lot of older Chinese American immigrants use or get most of their information and their ideas from, which is WeChat.
Wow.
So I just really wanted to tap into the access to those communities to share these words with them.
Great. Well, so what kind of response did you get?
So far the response has been very varied, much bigger than I expected. It sort of blew up on the internet. The most visible kind of responses are people really criticizing my letter and being very defensive about our community's anti-Blackness or perpetuating the model minority myth by saying things like, oh, like the Black community struggles because they just didn't work hard enough, and look at us, we worked so hard and that's why we have everything, which is, I mean, that's absolutely false. But on the other hand, I've had a lot of people reach out to me either through email or on social media talking about how much this letter touched them or how it helped them talk about anti-Blackness with their family, which is usually a very uncomfortable and difficult conversation to, broach with your family. But as we've seen from the huge response to my letter, it's absolutely very necessary and very urgent.
You wrote, quote, Though we cannot compare the challenges faced by Asian Americans to the far more violent atrocities suffered by Black Americans, we owe everything to them. So what stands out in your mind when you say we owe everything to them?
Yeah, well, that's actually a line that a lot of people have caught on to in my essay.
Yeah.
Think pieces attempting to debunk it and saying, oh, that line is not true. Like, we've contributed very much as Chinese Americans and as Asian Americans to this country. And I mean, that's true. We have contributed a lot. But also, I think we've contributed to a lot of its violence and a lot of its anti-Blackness and its evils. And that's something that we have to really reckon with. And I absolutely do stand by that statement. I think a lot of the civil rights gains that we have, I mean, even the ability for people like my family and for basically all the Asian American families who immigrated here after the 1970s, we literally owe our existence on this land to Black Americans and to other Black and Indigenous people of color in the United States who have fought so hard to gain dignity and to be recognized by the state and also be given this sort of autonomy. The whole reason so many Asian American immigrants are here was because that there used to be these really racist immigration quotas put in place starting in the 1920s, even extending before the 1920s, starting with things like the Chinese Exclusion Act that barred so many Asian immigrants from entering the United States. But all those quotas were struck down and abolished in 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Hart-Celler Act, which was largely pushed or largely pressured by Black civil rights activists. So that's one huge piece of legislation that was largely passed due to the efforts of Black activists and Black Americans. The term Asian American, we can't take that for granted. Before the 1970s or before this third world liberation movement, we didn't have a formal name for ourselves. We were either, called Chinese people or Filipinos or Orientals.
Right. We're not American, even though we might have been born here.
There was no sense of collective organizing or power until these Asian American activists were inspired by Black activists to coin a term for our community. So we wouldn't even have a name for ourselves if it weren't for Black activism.
Well, thank you. You feel very strongly about that. I can hear in your voice. So I want to just dial back a little bit about some of the things you grew up hearing, especially the part about, I'd rather you not be friends with Black people. I'd rather you not be involved in Black activism. Do you have friends who are Black, and are you involved in Black activism?
I definitely do have friends who are Black, but I don't think that's, a reason, the only reason you should be involved in Black activism is, it shouldn't be because it directly affects you and your friend circle. I mean, you should simply do it because it's right. It's very violent not to be involved in Black activism because it's really upholding white silence and white complicity and therefore white supremacy. And I definitely don't feel the need to, tokenize my Black loved ones to sort of justify why I'm interested in Black activism. It's very crucial to participate in Black Lives Matter because it supports the liberation of even our own people, of Asian Americans, because ultimately both movements fight against white supremacy and try to chip away at these structures of institutional racism. And secondly, most importantly, it's simply right to stand up for other people and to protect people that we care about.
Well, I appreciate your very strong voice. I can definitely hear it articulated from a very strong spine. Where did that come from? Where did you grow up, Eileen?
So I grew up in New Jersey, suburban New Jersey, and I grew up for a bit in a place called Middlesex County, which was quite diverse, had a large Asian American population. But then after, a bit of my childhood, I moved to a very conservative, very white county in New Jersey called Monmouth County. And so my neighborhood that I grew up in was very conservative and affluent and white. And that was true of a lot of the spaces around me. So definitely not a very diverse place. I was exposed to a lot of microaggression.
Like what? Yeah, tell me more about that. Like what?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure these are things, unfortunately, very familiar for any kind of Asian American child, but hearing things like, where are you actually from? Or, your English is so good. Or, even sometimes very nasty things like, go back to your country, or you see people openly mocking my parents for their accents or for their not so fluent English. Just those things, are very traumatizing for any child, but they're unfortunately very universal experiences for people of color in this country.
And how did you respond?
Well, I think if you're a child, it's very hard for you to respond and, and really understand those moments as being part of larger systems of like racism and white supremacy. When it happens to you as a child, you realize, okay, that made me uncomfortable, or I know it's not right, but it becomes really hard to vocalize why or to even understand why. But now that I'm older, when a lot of people get older, we recognize and we're able to contextualize those experiences as moments of deep racism. That has, driven me to be very outspoken about racial equity and about Asian American and Black liberation. I just really have no tolerance for racism anymore.
Right. So growing up with that kind of experiences, were you able to talk to your parents about it?
I had a very difficult time talking to my parents about it because even though we experienced the same kind of racism, I think, the older generation internalizes it very differently or understands it very differently. So when a racist moment would happen to me, like as a teenager, I'd be like, okay, that was very racist. That was wrong. I have to say something. I have to stand up and sort of fight back. And my parents would be like, oh, people have problems, just ignore it and move on with your life. And I think that's an attitude that unfortunately a lot of older Asian American immigrants have, where they think, part of microaggressions and racial slurs and these instances of everyday racism, which can turn really violent and damaging, are simply aspects of life that you have to endure if you want to be successful in America. And I think that sort of mentality comes from things like the model minority myth, which is this idea that it's okay, to experience racial trauma and to experience these things because that's ultimately what you have to do to get ahead in this country. But those things are very false. So I think I had a hard time talking to my parents about it because they sort of had that kind of attitude. But that's why I was really driven to write this letter and to show the simultaneous struggle of the Asian American community along with the Black community, to show that, it's okay to talk about race. It's actually very important and very necessary that we talk about race and how we are racialized and treated in this country.
As a result of your letter to the Chinese American community at Yale, was it possible to have a dialogue with your family? Is that important for you to use this as an opening for a conversation?
It's very hard to talk about anti-Blackness and things like police brutality with our parents because they just don't think it's an issue. But I'm really glad that my article caused such a stir in the community that it forces people to confront that anti-Blackness, whether they understand it and they acknowledge it or whether they defend it. But I think it's really important that people are talking about it.
Well, if you didn't write it and it didn't catch our team's attention, we wouldn't be talking about it here now. And so I'm grateful for that. It's a great teachable moment. Well, let me ask you this then. When Obama was elected, did your parents change their mind about that? Was that a pivot? Was it a turning point in their perception about African Americans in this country?
Obama's election was very monumental and it was symbolic, but it definitely didn't, represent a resolution to all the issues we're seeing with anti-Blackness and, systemic racism in this country. My parents were Obama supporters in 2008. They did see a lot of value in his message. They resonated a lot with his story as this Black man who became very successful. Yeah, I think there was a bit of that model minority favoritism. But yeah, I don't think it significantly changed their view on, the Black struggle.
Well, I wonder if we can dig a little deeper on that. You mentioned several times older and different generation. Do you definitely think that it's a generational difference, or you think that it is cultural, meaning that the Asian culture overall is very rooted in meritocracy, right? So they look at what you have achieved in life to merit respect, right? It needs to be earned, right?
It's very natural for Asian American immigrants, especially the older generation, to believe in meritocracy. But I don't just think it's a cultural phenomenon. I think it's also rooted in a lot of historical reasons, a lack of understanding or this gap between when our parents came here and also between things like the civil rights movement and Black liberation movements. A lot of Asian American immigrants don't speak fluent English, so that can be a barrier to voting and understanding and engaging with American history and politics. I mentioned this in my essay. During the Cold War, a lot of Chinese Americans were actually preyed upon by the U.S. government to terrorize them or scare them from participating in politics or being politically vocal.
Well, when did your parents come to the United States, and how did they integrate and advance in society? Are they professionals?
Yeah, so my parents came to the U.S. In the early 90s, and they came for graduate school. So already it wasn't like they came to this country with nothing. They came here to get their master's and PhD degrees. So already, coming into this country, they're already very highly educated and from, a higher income level, higher class standing in China. And I think that's very true of a lot of Asian Americans, though I really can't generalize because there are Asian Americans who are low income or, who come from varying levels of class privilege. But for a good number of Asian Americans in this country, they come here already quite upwardly mobile. So I would say this idea that they built everything from scratch is absolutely a myth.
In your writing, you cited the poet Cathy Park Hong, who wrote, I believe that we are, quote, next in line to disappear, end quote, to gain the privileges that white people have, to be freed from all the burdens that come with existing in a body of color. However, our survival in this country has always been conditional. Tell me more. What do you mean by that? What do you know?
A lot of one of the harms of the model minority myth, which is that Asian Americans generally enjoy more class privilege and they are not subjected to the same violence of racism that a lot of Black Americans are, like police brutality, criminal justice system, and those things. It's because, we're just naturally better and we work harder, but that's definitely not true. If you look in history, as I mentioned in my article, Asian Americans are one of the first racialized minorities in this country with things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigrants from entering the country solely because of their race. The minute World War II struck, the detention of Japanese Americans, how quickly we turned from this emblem of working class success to enemies and traitors and dangerous people. Same thing with Chinese Americans at the height of the Cold War who were suspected of being communists. And even today with coronavirus, hardworking group of model minorities suddenly becomes these disease carriers and bat eaters. So I just, wanted to make clear to people who think that we live in this sort of post-racial society where Asian American identity doesn't affect how we're treated. That's not true. Our quote-unquote success in this country is very, very conditional. And that's because of white supremacy that continue to hurt our communities.
Well, in your piece, you have a beautiful summary of the history of Asian immigrants trying to assert their rights and status as citizens in this country. Tell me what is most memorable and meaningful to you.
I think, a really important contribution that Asian Americans have made to this country is redefining the role of the citizen. I think due to a lot of the efforts of the Asian American community, now the category of citizenship has been expanded and it's not, as racialized as it was before.
I want to ask you about how you see yourself in America. Do you identify as Asian American, or do you identify with the ethnic origin of your Asian roots? And if so, what is that?
I definitely view Asian American as less of an all-encompassing label for my identity and more of this tool that can be used for political and social organizing. Asian American, it originated as not a tool to describe a group of people, but to group together a set of people with common struggles and common experiences. Having been born in the United States, I definitely am very aware of how racism works in this country and the kind of harms that it can cause. So I feel very determined to speak out about that.
Have you witnessed any tension between Asian and Black during the peak of the pandemic?
As an Asian American woman myself, I'm very aware of anti-Asian racism that really was intensified during the first surge of COVID-19. I mean, I've experienced racism firsthand. Like, people have commented on my social media telling me I was a bat eater, or in public, people walk away from you or they make sort of these nasty gestures at you. So I myself am definitely very aware of anti-Asian racism, though I'm not really interested in engaging with arguments about, these so-called tensions between the Black and Asian community, because I think those are used as sort of right-wing talking points to discourage Asian Americans, Chinese Americans from participating in Black Lives Matter. The sort of heightened focus on these individual videos of Black Americans attacking Asian Americans, that's mostly a distraction. It definitely happens, but ultimately it's used as a device to get us to isolate ourselves from the Black community, which is clearly not what we should be doing at all.
What are some of the ways that you've been stretched or challenged when you face the pandemic and the hate threatening our personal health when you're out there protesting?
I think it's much less a challenge for me, this East Asian, class-privileged, highly educated woman to appear on the streets and protest because my body offers me a lot of privileges. Racism is a public health crisis as well. You see all these Black people just being shot and killed simply for existing for senseless reasons. If we don't address that as a society, we're not really addressing a huge public health crisis in our country.
Well, lastly, I just want you to describe this moment. What is your sense of the urgency of this moment, and why now?
Anti-Blackness or anti-racism is always urgent and it's always pressing. I mean, it's just the most visible right now because this is probably one of the biggest civil rights unrests or movements I've seen in my lifetime. Racism is very foundational to America. I mean, this entire country was founded upon slavery and genocide of indigenous peoples. So I would say these things are always happening and we have to just always continue to engage with them.
Thank you, Eileen. If you're interested in following Eileen Huang's anti-racism work, just go to ChineseAmerican.org or 美国华人 online or on WeChat. In our next episode of True Colors,
Asians like to keep their heads down, avoid attention that may be negative because of their own experience with people in power. And so people end up retreating, do what we need to do to survive. But by doing that, we are supporting and colluding with racism.
Growing up as an Asian American here, I don't really hear that too often, that AAPIs have been on the forefront with Black and African American communities to fight for social justice. We both experience discrimination. We have to be able to empathize with each other's pains.
That is Jenny Chang and Dr. Mabel Lamb with the Asian American Commission in the state of Massachusetts. Reflect and reach across. That is our next episode in 2 weeks. 1 in a Billion is
Brian Latwinowicz,
Yvette Yu, Maggie She, Leah Yen Jarrett.
And our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy. Let us know if you want to join our team of volunteers, help us plan events, pitch a story. Just go to our website, oneinaBillionVoices.org, and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.